Hey nerds. So I'm going to continue my series on this book, English Philosophers from Bacon to Mill, the Old Golden Age of Philosophy, which is, of course, a compilation of excerpts of famous books from English Enlightenment philosophers. And I've been through John Locke, for example, the famous empiricist, talking about some of his work. And this is John Stuart Mill, who plenty of people have heard of course. He had this really famous book on liberty in which he talks about freedom of speech, the classical liberal perspective on liberal speech, basically, which tons of people have talked about many times before. And what I find interesting about this section, though, is that he highlights and stresses the limits on freedom, where the freedom of the individual ends and where the freedom of the society begins. Because unless you're an anarchist, at some point you're going to accept government authority of some kind at some level, right? So it's interesting. So let's get into the quote here. All right. Of the limits to the authority of society over the individual. What then is the rightful limit to the sovereignty of the individual over himself? Like I said, where do we find that balance? Where do we draw the line? Where does the authority of society begin? You can think of many examples of this, right? Like let's say vaccines and COVID, for example. A lot of people had this notion, it infringes my freedom if the government wants me to get vaccinated. But I mean, I don't think vaccine mandates are a good idea, but at a certain point, you have to decide, unless you're an anarchist, and a lot of these people claim to be conservatives, where your personal freedom ends and where the freedom of society begins. Because if you're not, like I said, I don't care whether everyone gets vaccinated, but if you're not getting vaccinated, you're still unintentionally, or maybe even intentionally, but probably unintentionally, causing harm to others around you. So this is a way in which your individual freedom interferes with the individual freedom of others. So this is why living with people in a society is complex, right? Because everyone has individual freedom, but you don't want anyone's individual freedom to impinge on anyone else's individual freedom. And we always have to find this delicate balance, and where we accept that someone's individual freedom is more important than ours at a particular time, where we draw the line, where we should accept government authority, where we shouldn't. Tons of people disagree about this all over the place, right? Okay, so how much of human life should be assigned to individuality, and how much to society? So, like I said, how much individuality should we have? How much collectivization should we have as a society? Not even in like necessarily a government sense, but in a cultural sense. This is why people have radically different political ideologies, because we disagree about where to draw the line and how you find that balance, how you define where individual freedom ends and the freedom of society and other individuals working together collectively begins, basically. So each will receive its proper share if each has that which more particularly concerns it. So everyone has to have their own individual freedom that doesn't impinge on other people's freedom. And that's why at a certain point, individual freedom ends and the freedom of other individuals in the society begins, in order so that everyone can have as much individual freedom as possible without interfering with other people's individual freedoms, right? Okay, so to individuality should belong the part of life in which it is chiefly the individual that is interested. Everything that's going on in your individual life, work, job, family, that sort of thing, right? To society, the part which chiefly interests society. So how can we work together to accomplish things? We have to talk about how our personal individual freedoms interfere with each other sometimes. You can think of innumerable examples, neighbors and property disputes, like car crashes, like government, like vaccine mandates, that sort of thing. There are tons and tons of examples of this, obviously. And so, but we have to work together, because if we all just only prioritize our own individual freedom all the time, then we can't work with each other and form a collective and form a functioning society, I should say, because our individual freedoms are always going to end up on other people's individual freedoms and vice versa. So yeah, anyway, in a nutshell, I really, like I said, I really like this section of John Stuart Mill's on liberty because he stresses the limits on freedom. And like I said, these are questions that we should always ask ourselves, and most of the time most people don't, right? And people have very different answers about this. So let me know your answers to this question or these questions in the comments. Where should individual freedom end, and where should the freedom of society take over? So how can we work together in a society in which we all prioritize our individual freedoms while also prioritizing the individual freedoms of others? So in the comments, ask me, at what point should individual freedom end, or should it end at all? And at what point should society interfere, whether you're talking about government or culture? Let me know in the comments. And yeah, sometimes there should be limits on individual freedom.